Blur's The Great Escape was released on September 11th, 1995, produced by Stephen Street and released on Virgin Records and Food. This was the band's fourth album. It was originally met with critical acclaim, but within just a few months of being released, it developed a reputation as one of the band's worst albums. But today, we are going to make the case that the initial assessment of The Great Escape was the right one. Welcome to Self Titled, a podcast about music. My name is Seth Sparks. I'm about to be joined by my co host, Josh Best. This was actually the first ever episode that we recorded. We didn't really have a title, and we hadn't figured out a way to introduce the show, so we just started talking, which is why I recorded this intro to insert here at the beginning. We're about to dive right in, but before we do, if you enjoy what we're doing, like the video, subscribe to the channel. It really is a big help. Okay, on with the show. We're talking about The Great Escape, Blur's The Great Escape. I mean, this album came out in 1995, September 11th. You know, there's a whole lot of history with it. I don't think either of us knew anything about that. I don't know, 14 years old, I guess, at that point. And yeah, we were in this small town in rural America. And it's like, well, and that's the case. You're not plugged into the British music scene. What's your connection to The Great Escape?
The Great Escape came out in 95. I would say I probably didn't even discover it until maybe 98 or 99. Before you really discovered Blur, we had both heard Song 2.
Yeah.
And loved Song 2 when it came out. But that was probably our first introduction to Blur. And then I think you went to Europe and, was introduced to Blur by your older brother. And then you came home fired up about Park Life and played Park Life for us. And then I just remember going to a record store one day and seeing a Blur album called The Great Escape. The only thing that had to get me to buy it was that it was an album by Blur, but I remember having a catchy picture on the front, and I'm just like, oh, cool, Blur album. And I don't know if I even looked at the back to see when it came out. I could have thought it was brand new. I could have thought it was old. I don't really remember. I'm just thinking, hey, here's a Blur album that I've never heard before. Let me snatch this up.
And that's kind of how things worked at that time. It was just like you go to, I mean, the internet exists, sure, but we don't know how to navigate it all that well. And you just kind of like take what is given to you, which is why Song 2 hit us, is because it hit the mainstream in the US. And that was the introduction, was this kind of like, okay, well, who are these guys? Very different band. It's a very different band than the band that released The Great Escape and Park Life and Modern Life is Rubbish. This is Blur's fourth album. There was Leisure was the first album, and then you have what they call the Life trilogy, which is 1993. And I mean, dude, we're talk about a run here. We have 1993 Modern Life is Rubbish, we have 1994 Park Life, and then 1995 The Great Escape. I mean, that is a prolific 3 years from this band. Researching this, I learned more about the Life trilogy. And I'd always thought of those albums like that because they shared this DNA. It's very British. But, this album was a smash over there. For us, it was a discovery and an amazing one at that. But it was a triple platinum #1 album in the UK. It was greeted as soon as it was released with basically universal critical acclaim, but then it kind of develops like a dubious reputation in the UK, and even eventually, I think to some extent, amongst like some of Blur's own fan base. But for us, where we were in our little bubble, we were completely free of the noise that surrounds this album. It wasn't on our radar. We didn't have any idea about the rivalry that kind of just colors this whole album. I don't like it when conversations about Blur inevitably involve Oasis. I think it's unfair, but I think you have to have it in the context of The Great Escape because of what was going on. But before we get into the Britpop thing, let me just set the stage, okay? It's 1995. When you look outside of Britpop, we have Melancholy, Infinite Sadness. We have Green Day's Insomniac. Jerry Garcia dies in 1995. We have Bjork's Post, Jagged Little Pill, Alanis Morissette, Pavement's Wowie Zowie, Elliott Smith's self-titled album. Gangsta's Paradise is just like, you can't get away from it. Everything you turn on is Gangsta's Paradise. Sparkle and Fade from Everclear. Foo Fighters self-titled, Daft Punk's Defunk, the Nirvanas, the Pearl Jams, they've really seeped into, like, every facet of culture around the world, and it's kind of like that era, if you look at, like, the heyday of grunge or, that alt rock, it's giving way to something else. It's almost like, I mean, these movements don't last long, whether it's the grunge movement or the Britpop movement or whatever, and I feel like it's on its way out. What stands out to you?
Well, I guess what stands out to me musically is all those American acts you said kind of remind me of something edgy, alternative, things that were designed to be only admired by a few became mainstream and popular. Like Nirvana, Foo Fighters, Green Day. These are not things, Alanis Morissette. It's not things that you would think, oh yeah, that's pop music. Uh, and I just think about how different Blur is. I think if I was introduced to Modern Life of Rubbish and Park Life in 93 and 94, I don't know that I would have been ready for it and would have gravitated to it because I was, you know, it's so funny. You think about those years and how old we are. I mean, we're like 12 and 13 years old. I mean, we're just coming into adolescence. I remember kind of going from like this MC Hammer, Boys to Men, you know, Nirvana, and just thinking about how important things were that it was like, I'm just, what I get hung up on is I keep thinking about songs on the three, what do we call it? The three Life albums
Hmm.
with the horns and the Britpop, that very iconic sound. I don't think America was ready for that in the
Yeah.
in the early 90s. So I guess long story longer, what I got from that is the huge difference from what was going on in Britain and what was going on in America, two total separate things. And we don't remember it being on our radar at all, what was going on.
No.
So also at that time, in the early 90s, we're dependent on MTV.
Yeah.
In radio to kind of tell us, okay, here's the cool stuff out there, and so I don't remember MTV or American pop radio really letting us on to what was going on in Britain.
Yeah, we were absolutely isolated from all of that stuff unless it was given to you through the channels in which you like consumed media, which is, for us, it's MTV, it's the radio. But if they weren't on any of those channels, then, you're not finding it. And you're right, it stands out that how different that music is. I think that it's interesting because I think there was something very intentional about a lot of the artists in the Britpop movement to be different. I think it was a reaction to what was going on because all the alternative stuff was huge over there. I think that at this time, especially if you read into Blur's history, they're touring the United States in the early 90s. It doesn't go well. Not surprisingly. I mean, there's nothing about their music that is catering to an American audience. It's very specific. So it's not a surprise that it doesn't. But in England, I mean, if you look at what's going on over there, it is different than what we're hearing. Of course, what we're talking about today, The Great Escape, the one thing that did poke through, which we will definitely get into, is Oasis, What's the Story, Morning Glory. I remember buying that album, and Wonderwall was about as ubiquitous as Gangsta's Paradise in that year. But then there's other cool stuff going on too. You have Supergrass, I Should Coco, which is a great album, Alaska's self-titled album, Pulp's Different Class, which one of my favorite albums of all time. Of course, you have Radiohead with the Bends. I mean, it's a different world that is going on over there, and they're pumping out great music. But then, if you look at Blur's trajectory at this point, I think that the interesting thing about Blur is their sound is also very distinct from the other Britpop band sound too, you know? Yeah, tell me what you're thinking about all of those albums in the Britpop movement when you hear those listed out.
Blur toured America and it didn't really go over well. but Oasis did go over well. And then you named Radiohead and Supergrass. I was thinking, first of all, I love Blur, Radiohead, Supergrass, and I listened to Oasis when it first came out. I never became a huge fan, but I've listened to those songs numerous times. And I think when you listen to Blur and Radiohead and a lot of songs, it's hard to understand what they're saying. And they're using very British slang, uh, language that is spoken in England and not in America. So it's hard to you can't anticipate the lyric that's coming up or maybe even decipher what in the heck they're saying. Whereas I think Oasis and Supergrass deliberately or at least made an effort to we're going to speak clearly or enunciate or whatever when we sing so that our lyrics will be understood. And maybe I don't remember Supergrass or Oasis really using like really rigorous slang. I feel like their lyrics were more poetic or or just not using, British slang.
I think the thing that really roped me in was the musicality of it, and that is what gets you on these albums. And when you think about it, like, I mean, I think the general consensus is that like an album that like Leisure is not the band's finest album. It's a first album, and it's them kind of listening to what the studio is saying that or what the label is saying needs to be produced in order to be successful. So it's kind of tossed away, but I mean, there's some good songs on that album, and it's somewhere along that point that recorded Sing, which is an amazing song. But then you get into the trilogy, and you have Modern Life is Rubbish, Park Life, and The Great Escape, and those 3 years. I mean, the whole context, I think, of The Great Escape is built upon what happened Park Life, because Modern Life, I think, was like miles ahead of Leisure in its like complexity and lyrically and everything. It's a huge jump. I think it gets them back in the good graces of critics and the fans, and they start selling albums. But then Park Life comes along, and it's just an absolute juggernaut. It debuted at number one on the UK albums charts. It stayed there on the chart for 90 weeks. It reached number 6 on the Billboard Top Heat Seekers album chart in the United States, which is so it was probably in more metropolitan areas, but it was heard. They were even getting some popularity here in the States. 4 awards at the 1995 Brit Awards, though I know nothing about that. It is spoken of as though that's a huge deal. And even today, it's like revered everywhere. It's on Rolling Stone's 500 greatest albums of all time. Yeah, but okay, we won't do a huge deep dive, but I mean, dude, Park Life, what's going on with that album?
Right. Yeah, Park Life is brilliant and a great musical achievement. I think at the time when I first was introduced to it, I was like, okay, what do I make of this? And I even remember Park Life. I even remember when you played me the thought Park Life. I was like, I don't know if I can get down with this. Like, why is there a guy talking? I don't mean somebody talking a verse. Like, what are we? Are we listening to a TV show or what is this? And the I am a horn player. With some of the like British horns, I'm just like, this sounds so silly or outdated or I don't know what to make of it. Well, even when I was first introduced to it, there were definitely a handful of songs that spoke to me immediately that I was just like, okay, that's brilliant and I love this. But as far as an album, I don't know that I was really on board until later on in life when I went back and revisited. And then I appreciated some of those things that as a younger person, I kind of thought was maybe corny or silly. But I think Park Life stands the test of time sounds as good to me, if not better today than it did in the late 90s when I was listening to it for the first time. So, yeah, what a beautiful album.
It's amazing. Like you said, I had heard song 2, and then I go over to visit my brother. He's living in Germany at the time in Heidelberg, and he has Park Life on CD, and he's like, "You have to hear this. It's amazing. It's super popular over here too. It's just like this is everywhere, and it's really good." Just because I think that it was so different than everything that was going on at the time, and it was like, wow, people are making music like this that's musical. It was the one touch point that I had that Blur was pulling from in like as far as their influences go, I think was the Beatles. And the Beatles had this ability to do like if you look at the White Album, you have everything from like Helter Skelter, which is, a heavier, like just rock song, to more almost vaudevillian sort of like old school, it's like almost pre-war jazz stuff like Honey Pie or something. And they weren't afraid to go there, especially Paul. And I feel like that sort of range and versatility is so hard to find. And the fact that these guys embraced it. But it also, the thing is, even though I noticed that in the music, it sounded like it was from a completely different planet. I didn't know their influences at the time, and I'm more familiar with them now. But in addition to the Beatles, I mean, you hear a lot of Bowie. The Kinks are really like you can really hear that British sort of commentary, which was big in the Kinks, especially in like their late '60s stuff. And I had no idea other than like "You Really Got Me" or whatever. That was all I knew of the Kinks at the time. I didn't know Village Green. So if you don't know that, if you don't know XTC or Wire or even like Duran Duran or Scott Walker, like if you don't know all of these things, which I didn't discover till later, it's like I just never heard anything like it. But again, it was very musical. It was surprising. It was sometimes challenging. There would be dissonance or just unusual things that would challenge you as a listener. Maybe we'll go deeper into Park Life someday just because it's such a great album. But Park Life's a massive hit. The band is under a lot of pressure. If you hear them talking about this time, it does not sound like a very happy time. Graham Coxon talks a lot in his book about the anxiety that he's going through. Of course, Park Life's such a smash that now they are talked about everywhere. They're winning these awards, and it's just a lot of attention and a lot of pressure. They were falling into the lifestyle I think that sometimes comes with being a massively popular band. There's starting to be frictions in the band, and you're also seeing them kind of splinter off into different social groups. Through all of this, they reconnect with their producer, Stephen Street, make The Great Escape. And as soon as it's released, people are just going crazy for this album. It's called Funny, Brave, and Heartbroken. It's called Utterly Beyond Contemporary Compare. The Melody Maker gave it a 12 out of 10. I mean, you might say some of the praise heaped on this was caught up in the moment, but I actually think knowing how this album became received eventually, I think it's a rare case when the first read of this album is closer to how I feel about it today and just about the reputation. I mean, even just a few months after this thing comes out, it's there's just a backlash. It seems like that's because of what's happening in the British music scene. The whole battle of Britpop thing and the big moment of the battle of Britpop with between Blur and Oasis. So when people talk about this album today, I think it's people that lived through it, that lived through seeing Damon on the cover of all these magazines and in interviews. And they talk about it in the context of this nasty rivalry with Oasis and this flood of almost overexposure for Blur in the UK. But I mean, you know, what obviously we weren't aware of that at the time, but what are your thoughts on the rivalry between Oasis and Blur?
Rivalries are something you see in sports. For art, you don't usually see that as much. I feel like in America, where artists a lot of times are trying to build each other up and help each other come along. And I feel like that's probably where Blur and Oasis were before Park Life and What's the Story, Morning Glory, before they really had their success. I'm sure they were playing a lot of the same circuits and supporting each other, but I think that's just kind of bizarre to see such a rivalry in music. And so definitely that's not something that I was even aware of until we became Blur fans, and this is, like, way after the fact of it happening. But, yeah, I thought it was extremely interesting to see how the bands, or their managers, or their people or whoever is influencing their decisions. I thought it was interesting some of the decisions that Blur made and Oasis made and this whole rivalry thing, and it's interesting to see how that affected certain people, especially Damon. And I don't even really know. You read things and people speculate about what may have caused the rivalry. I don't really, who really knows, but I think it's kind of bizarre. And I just think it's different to see that kind of rivalry between what you would call artists or musicians. But, everything is big business. And so, if you got to make some hard choices to get on top, I mean, that kind of stuff's been happening from the beginning of civilization. So,
Yeah, I think that it's true. They're very different bands. It's funny that they were so closely compared to each other for so long, but I feel like there's a whole lot about that rivalry that is interesting. The drama of it, I mean, it's interesting stuff. It's hard to deny. Like it gets really heated between them. They're kind of friends in the beginning, and like you said, I mean, there's a theory that it goes back to a woman, and maybe Damon and Liam had dated the same girl and that was a part of it. That's hinted at sometimes. Sometimes it's hinted at the fact that it's just a marketing tactic to sell albums and that it was very effective. And then there's just there's, just tensions between the two different bands. And, Liam was notably, I mean, even Noel too, but especially Liam was notably like, not afraid to shy away from confrontation. I think that there is, like you said, and we'll get into country house, the line in the sand, the big battle of Britpop. But when people talk about this album in the years following its release, it's spoken of, especially from Damon. I mean, it's a turning point. I don't know if he calls it that, but you can see it. You can see the way that they look in public appearances. I think this was a ended up being a difficult thing for the band to overcome, and I think that Damon took a lot of the fallout of what came into it personally. You'll see clips of him reluctantly talking about it and saying maybe he bought into it a little bit too much, got too carried away with it, and it kind of turns on him to the point where he's like heckled in the streets and stuff. Not by everyone, but I mean, there's just you're Blur or your Oasis as a fan, and that's kind of the ground that the line in the sand. So whether it's fans or Damon Album talking about himself, it's hard to distinguish whether they're talking about the album itself and the music on it, or they're talking about it in the context of all the stuff that happened at the time. But the same words get thrown around, the same language. People call this album, Damon has called it messy or uneven, with some people saying that this album contains some of the band's best work and some of their lowest lows. But I think it's really telling that if you ask those same people to rank their track listing on the album, it's going to be different. I think that some songs appeal to some people and some appeal to others. For me, there are different parts of this album that spoke to me, and there were some tracks that I just didn't really pay attention to that much. And going back and listening to it over and over again over the years, different tracks will stand out. And then preparing for this conversation, really listening to it on repeat, I yet again, like I have other favorites that I used to overlook. But yeah, so let's dive into this, man. We're gonna get into the track listing and we're gonna take it one by one. But some songs will need to be lingered on a little bit longer than others. But we're gonna open it up with the opening track, which is Stereotypes. This song, man, this album begins with a very jarring, almost dissonant sound from a synthesizer paired with Graham Coxon's guitar stabs. It's an interesting hint at what's going to come because the lyrical content is in many ways anxious, disillusioned, sneering commentary. But it's also because The Great Escape has so much of these beautiful songs and melodies mixed with dissonance, nervous energy. It's the third single that was released from this album, which looking back, I feel like this is kind of an unusual single I love the song. It's also ironic that the lyrics criticize the idea of stereotypes while also set the stage for stereotyping, which is essentially what the rest of the songs do on the album. But yeah, Stereotypes, great opener.
I agree. You know, as a music fan and a musician, I feel like first tracks of albums are just so important. And I loved how this album starts. I mean, just from the very beginning, like you said, that dissonant synthesizer just sets the tone for the album. I feel like this is one of those tracks that Blur likes to do. Reminds me of Boys and Girls off Park Life. It kind of mixes the rock with British club scene and just is like, upbeat party dance song. It's like, okay, we're a rock and roll band, but we can make you dance. And I just think it's a great start to the album.
Yeah, I love it. And that guitar work is really cool too. I mean, I'm going to be saying that a lot on this album. I'm a huge Graham Coxon fan. I think that opening chord, he's like stacking a minor on top of a major chord. He's stacking that minor third up there. It's just really cool stuff. Then it takes us to Country House. It's a Blur classic. And not surprisingly, the lead single, This Is It. This is ground zero for the Battle of Britpop. This is the song that made headlines. It was released on the same day as Oasis' Roll With It. There were a lot of I mean, you hinted at it, but there's the story. I mean, I think what really kicks this thing into high gear is there's animosity between the bands. Blur feels like they've been slighted in some way. There are news broadcasts and headlines leading up to the release of these two singles. And we know how things eventually play out with these two albums and their like embraced popularity around the world. Country House outsold Roll With It, which means that at the time, Blur were the the winners of the Battle of Britpop. They won the battle, even if Oasis won the war, I guess you could say. But at this point, I mean, we'll get into this after we talk through the tracks, but I mean, I don't know. I think it maybe has come full circle again. I want to note here that again, I don't think it's a fair thing to compare Oasis and Blur a lot. It's just it's a pretty juicy melodrama that's hard to resist. So I'm doing the thing I hate because this album in particular is so tied to that pop culture phenomenon. When we discuss other Blur albums, which I hope we do, I don't think that conversation will be as relevant. But this song is a great example of what Damon does throughout The Great Escape, which is take a classic melody and chord progression. He has sort of a joyous sing along chorus, and he writes lyrics that are not particularly happy lyrics. This was supposedly written about Blur's manager at the time. Graham's work on this song shows why he's such a unique player and just an essential part of Blur's sound. He writes these unexpected guitar lines and it really adds depth to songs. He took his craft very seriously of doing that. It was an intentional thing. And one of the more interesting things to me about Country House is the fact that really in retrospect, I don't think that Roll With It is that strong of a song. It's kind of a surprise that that's the lead single. I know that they don't often release the best song, what they think will be the biggest hit. The conversations about this later were that, oh, well, they're both crap songs. And, Graham doesn't speak that nicely about this song. And I think that if you look at the live set that Blur just played last year at Wembley, which they just released not that long ago as of recording this, that's still like Country House is still a song that Blur is playing live. So I think it says something about how even though they will, even Blur's own members will badmouth it, it's kind of stood the test of time. Then we get into Best Days. Graham says this is one of his favorite songs on the album. It does feel largely, though, like an overlooked song. It has that classic David Albarn melancholic, mournful feel, especially during the verse. And then it has a very catchy chorus and a really cool guitar part from Graham, a good solo where he credits a lot of double stop techniques and things that he was doing on the guitar that he was learning from players like George Harrison. And you can hear some of that in Best Days, just sort of another classic album. But I mean, the front part of this album, it moves and it goes right into Charmless Man, which is another song with very biting lyrics. The narrator seems to have a lot of disdain for its subject, but just another song where Damon is on a tear. It seems like it's almost effortless how he writes these catchy timeless melodies. But it's also interesting to hear about what the band was forced to do at this time, right? Especially when you read through Graham's book, you get a sense of like, well, anytime that you have a single, you now have to write all these B-sides. And so they're constantly being asked to write songs like, hey, go write a song for this. It's a never ending grind for them. And Damon's up for the challenge. And it's still how he kind of works today. He's a hardworking musician and just almost a compulsive songwriter. So yeah, I'm always taken with songs like this. And then we get into Fade Away. For a longest time, I think the first 4 tracks on this album were the ones that I really sat with the most. And then I would start skipping around to the tracks that I wanted to hear. But Fade Away is a great example of track number 5 is Fade Away. It's a gear that Blur has where they go into like an almost like sinister, I for lack of a better word, like circus-like sound. It's really interesting. The intermission in Modern Life is Rubbish has hints of that. The Debt Collector off of Park Life, not so much the sinister part, but that and Damon does a lot of that, I feel like with The Good, the Bad, and the Queen. So it's just a song about a couple that can't seem to connect. Most of the lyrical content on this album isn't as internally reflective as Damon's later work becomes. Even by the late 90s, he's writing more personal material. I do wonder if any of this touches on Damon's relationship with Elastica's Justine Frischman, but that's really just pure speculation on my part. Then we get into Top Man, Topman. Not one of the most memorable songs on the album for me, but I do love the vibe of this song. The chorus has a cool melody. I can hear the band's XTC influence on this song. I don't know exactly what Damon is singing about in this song, but he's not singing approvingly of his subject again. And also, I mean, shooting guns on the high street of love is just a great lyric. So I have to appreciate that. And then, I mean, you get into the Universal, which we're gonna have to talk about this one for a minute. I mean, this is one of the greatest Blur songs ever written. For me, it's one of the greatest pop songs ever written. Blur first tried the Universal for Park Life, but apparently it was only after they decided to incorporate strings that it came into its own. The best word I can think of to describe this song is timeless, both the music and the lyrics. It's my wife's favorite Blur song, is one of my favorite Alex James bass lines. It's more incredible work from Graham Cox and just subtle that neither of those guys are doing anything crazy. They're just writing parts that service the song. And like so many songs on this album, it feels like a continuation of a type of song that they've done before. Like I said, like a different gear that they can go into. They have a punk gear, they have a sing-along gear, a dancey gear, and I don't know what you call this gear other than, like, bittersweet, mournful, I feel like it's in the same gear as, like, To the End on Park Life, but yeah, tell me your thoughts. What about the Universal?
That's my favorite gear. That's my favorite Blur gear. The giant melancholy, bigger than life sound. Those are probably my favorite Blur songs. Yeah, the Universal. I mean, just such a beautiful song. Does it surprise me that it's your wife's favorite song because it's one of my favorite songs. I love when Damon uses strings, just it just makes such a big, beautiful sound. It's Universal just has these beautiful string lines. You can hear it in your head as I talk. That is the string line that leads up to the chorus that comes in. I mean, it's just so big, larger than life sound and beautiful. Such a great song.
There's a reason that Blur often closes their shows, especially the big shows where they have a big crowd. A great example of a good closer, a live performance of this is from 2012 at Hyde Park. You can find that on YouTube. I mean, it can give you chill bumps watching it. It's that type of song, and it creates that type of energy from the crowd. That idea that Blur almost revisits types of songs they've done on previous albums, I think it's something that critics see as a defect of this album specifically, or even Blur in general, but I personally kind of see it as an asset. I mean, they're playing with a lot of different genres and they just go back to them when they want to. So I really appreciate not only that this song exists, but it's also with others too in the same sort of like gear.
I think it's lazy and lame of critics that when they hear a song that reminds them of another song, they're like, oh, they're just playing that trick again. We've already seen that trick and you're going to give it to us again. It's like, what? This is an entire different song. Just because it
Yeah.
reminds you of another song doesn't mean they're just replaying another trick. I mean, come on.
Yeah, and it that pops up a lot on The Great Escape. It's like Parklife was so massive and so popular to this day that this album really just gets like put up against Parklife, and people I think often like try to imply that these songs are like an attempt to do what they did on Parklife. And when you take that out of the equation, I mean, we heard Parklife before we heard The Great Escape, but still like we didn't have that thing where we were so mired in it that we had to be that critical of it. And when you take it on its own merit, I think it really stands up. It holds up. And songs like Universal, I mean, come on. The video for this song is cool. If you ever want to check that out, directed by Jonathan Glazer. He later directs Under the Skin, Zone of Interest. It's very much like a Stanley Kubrick homage, especially a lot of Clockwork Orange influence in it. But yeah, a cool video. I think that a lot of the earlier Blur videos get a lot better throughout the years. Some of the earlier ones you watch and you're like, "Whoa, that is definitely 1993 or 1994." But the Universal is when I think we're starting to get into some really quality video work here. I won't say the same thing for Country House, but whatever. Maybe it hasn't aged as well, but it's a fun video. What are you gonna do? So after the Universal, which just ends side one, that's the end of side 1 for the album, not even the end of the album. But then we have first opener on side 2 would be Mr. Robinson's Quango. Sort of has a James Bond introduction that I appreciate. For me, the guitar line over the recurring theme is it's my favorite part. I mean, what Graham does here, I think, is what sets this apart. It's heavy, nasty at times, and slick at other times. Very classic Graham. More great work from Alex James. And then from bassist Alex James. Damon doesn't seem to be too fond of the character he's singing about, another seedy character. But there's Mr. Robinson's Quango, which I like, and it's grown on me. And then the other thing is like you've just heard the Universal, you got Mr. Robinson's Quango, and then it takes you to He Thought of Cars, one of the greatest Blur songs, right? One of the most overlooked as a classic. They don't play this in live shows anymore. The melancholy thing that Damon does so well, it's on full display here. Just some of my favorite Blur lyrics. Let's talk about He Thought of Cars.
Okay. I want to back up just for a second because I had to step away. So I missed some of the ones that we've already discussed. But I just wanted to say my first memories of The Great Escape, when I put on The Great Escape for the first time, when I'm listening to it by myself and with you for the first time and our other friends for the first time, the thing that hit me about The Great Escape is the first 4 tracks on the album almost feel like they all have a quality to them of, I've heard this song before. This is comfortable. This is something I can relate to. It's almost like the first time you ever hear a country house, it's like, oh, I'm pretty sure I've heard this song before. And it's not because you've heard it before. It's just country house is just a really well done pop song, in my opinion. It just has qualities that other songs that we've heard all our lives have. So I feel like that's how you really, that's just one of the reasons why you really gravitate to it or cling on to it almost immediately. So then we have maybe a couple of songs that, you know, you and I would say maybe this is a little more challenging to listen to. It takes a little sidetrack. Mr. Robinson's Quango is definitely one of these tracks that has grown on me that I probably dismissed when I was younger and just like, okay, let's skip ahead to the next track. But now when I go back and listen to it, Mr. Robinson's Quingo kind of is to me like one of those quintessential Blur songs that is like, okay, if you just want to see a song to encompass what Blur is, that's Mr. Robertson Quango. It's just got a little bit of everything, you know? It's got those horns and the talking and the all the Britpop and all that into one, but I think it's a great song. Okay, so then after Mr. Robinson's Quango ends, then here comes He Thought of Cars. I don't know if I really fully grasped He Thought of Cars or if I even remember He Thought of Cars from when we were teenagers first listening to The Great Escape. I feel like it's one of those songs that I found later that has become one of my all-time favorite songs. His He Thought of Cars maybe it's probably in my top 5 songs of all time, which definitely makes it one of my favorite Blur songs. It's probably my favorite Blur song. I feel like He Thought of Cars is in that gear of the universal of the giant sound, the melancholy melody. I feel like it's an anthem. It has that gigantic downbeat where you can just see somebody in the background playing like a gigantic timpani drum or something, just pounding it with a sledgehammer on the downbeat. And you have the beautiful chorus, and then you have the hook that comes right after the chorus, the na 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 na.
Yeah.
I mean, there's just it's like every part of the song when it hits, it's like, yep, that's it. That's what we were going for, and you just nailed it right on the head.
I just don't know other song like you said, it's reminiscent of that gear from the Universal, maybe, like, This Is a Low off of Park Life, but it's also I've just never heard a song like it, like, even though it's in those gears, it also just stands apart. There's some special alchemy with this song, with all the different parts combining. Also, one of my favorite Graham Coxon parts, there's the intro and the chorus where he's slamming that G7, he adds this little wicked bend slide up to the 12th fret. It's just like this demented sounding yet beautiful noise on his guitar. Those bends during the chorus with all that echo on it, it's just beautiful stuff. It takes it to another level. I wish this one was still in the rotation. I don't know why this isn't a thing where the crowd goes crazy if they don't play He Thought of Cars. It's that good.
Yeah. And, I'm trying to think of, as I was describing it, I was trying to think of the parts of the song that just drive, what is it about this song that I like? I do love the high harmonies. We talk about songs sounding larger than life, big, and when you add all those voices in there, I love how Damon Albarn uses high range vocals. I love high harmonies. I love all harmonies, but there's something about, when I'm singing the song, I'm usually singing that crazy high part in like some falsetto voice that it probably sounds terrible to everybody around me. But that's like when I hear that part of the song, that's what I like and what I want to sing.
And another shout out to Graham too, because when you watch them play live, you realize how much he does. Like he sings so many harmonies because Blur has a lot of harmonies and he is playing pretty intricate guitar parts. He's singing and he's also pedals are such a huge part of his sound and it's kind of a pain in the ass to like navigate pedals in front of you when you need to change from one section of the song to the other. So he's a busy guy and you can really see it in the live performances. I also see it in live performances of the next song on the album, which is "It Could Be You." It's funny how they tear this off and it just kind of blends into the background because this album's just so stacked, but it's a great song. It's my favorite, like, rediscovery after listening to this album to prepare for this conversation because I don't know, it has all the elements of a classic Blur song. It has a catchy chorus, it's well written, the guitar work really sets it apart. This could be like another band's best song, but it's just kind of like business as usual for Blur.
I tend to gravitate songs with more energy, which is surprising why I love He Thought of Cars so much because I think it does have that anthem time signature. It's like a slower, like I was saying, like a sledgehammer downbeat, whereas It Could Be You is much more energetic. And I love energetic songs. And yeah, so this has all the energy. I think it's fun that this song about winning the lottery, It Could Be You. But when I was younger, most of the time I'm so keen on the instruments and listening to the instruments, I miss the lyrics. For years, I didn't even pay attention to the lyrics. When I'm trying to sing along, I'm probably just singing absolute nonsense, like phonetic sounds. Like to this day, in the car, my wife is probably like, listen to me, like, what kind of nonsense? You're not even singing words. Like, you don't know the words. Why are you singing? That doesn't even matter to me. The music matters, the notes matter. But as I get older, and it's so much easier listening to music. We have these platforms to where we listen to music and the lyrics just pop up too, and you just hit a button and the lyrics stream with the music. So now, for the first time, I'm paying attention to the lyrics too, discovering lyrics for the first time to music that I've loved all my life. All the music that we love, that we listened to when we were teenagers in our early 20s, they could have been singing la la la, bye bye bye, fa 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 fa. It would have been the same to me. I would have loved the song to be, you hear some music fans that are just like, oh, I like a song that tells a good story, and that just never was me. I wasn't concerned. I didn't really care because I'm so into what the bass player doing, what's the drummer doing, what's the harmonies, what's the notes. I was more into the notes. And so now as we're going back and listening to music that we love all over again with a new looking at it through new lenses and looking at the lyrics too, Blur just blows my mind with their lyrics too. The lyrics are just always really good. And like you said, what an asset to have in the band like Graham that can do all that stuff. I mean, you're a four-piece band and your guitar player is just covering so much stuff. I mean, he's doing so much stuff for you. And like you said, playing guitar licks where like he's doing stuff before people were doing things with electronics. He's doing that with his guitar. He's like, yeah, you know what? I don't need a program. I'll just put my pinky over here and bend the string a little.
The thing that you never hear is any other guitar player not just give love to Graham, especially like even the bands they're competitive with. You'll hear Johnny Greenwood sing Graham's praises. You hear Noel Gallagher sing his praises. I mean, if you're paying attention at all to Blur, it's just inescapable how important he is in the equation. And then we move on to Arnold Same, which I don't know, another carnival-esque song, gorgeous, gorgeous song, but also sounds like The Dead Collector, like these other songs where it's like, okay, here we're going into another sphere. I never really paid attention to this one too much at first, but I love it now. So many songs of this on this album are so uniquely Blur. I think this is one of them. Lyrically, it's a commentary on a type of person in modern life, but I think it's way more general, a way more sympathetic take. At least it's a little less sneering. But another really pretty song, also with talking on it, a good classic that I think I kind of overlooked for a long time. And then we move right along to Globe Alone, which Blur loves to open the valve once or twice on most albums. That's what they do here. Very much punk Blur with some wicked synthesizers thrown in. Dave Roundtree, who I haven't talked about enough on this album, really great drummer, always shines in songs like these just for his ability to play fast and energetically. The lyrics are just a riff on materialism, but another good song kind of tucked in this barrage of songs, which takes us to Dan Abnormal, which I sometimes forget about this song, but I also love this one. The main groove in this song and the chorus, it's just, I feel like this is another song. It could only be written by Blur. Just no band sounds like this. Of course, Dan Abnormal is an anagram for Damon Albarn. At one point, he says that Dan Abnormal is me. I think he even says that in the lyrics. So it's pretty explicit, maybe an autobiographical song of sorts. Seems to be about an unusual person who entertains their community. The person deserves some grace because of the strangeness of his environment that's made him that way. But interestingly, one of the more sympathetic set of lyrics on the album. So Damon is taking it easier on himself than some of the others he's commenting on. But I do think it's interesting that he talks about imitating or aping others in the lyrics. And I wonder if that's some sort of commentary about Damon feeling like he's not original, or perhaps if I'm just reading too much into it. But again, Dave Roundtree, Graham, both doing great work on Dan Abnormal. We get into a banger, like a straight up banger. Entertain Me. Alex James bass line, I mean, maybe his best, maybe my favorite. At least what bass player wouldn't be proud of a bass line like Entertain Me? Graham says that the way that Alex James plays bass is almost like a lead guitarist with just four lower register strings. I think that you can hear it in a song like this. Originally, this song, I wish they played live more. I don't know why they don't. I don't know why this one didn't catch on. This in the song was initially called Bored Housewives. Lyrics are a little abstract, but it's clearly dealing with some themes of like the rest of the album, mundanity, followed by attempts to find some sort of joy, sometimes in sort of seedy ways. But dude, Entertain Me is just one that it's been one of my favorites for years from this album.
I totally agree. It's one of those songs that as soon as you say the name of the song, I just want to sing the name of the song. You know, I just want to sing that part in the song. So, you know, it's the songwriting move that Damon uses where one voice sings one song part and holds it out while somebody else sings another part, which is always fun. I feel like Entertain Me has that same kind of Alex James bass line as Boys and Girls from Park Life and Stereotypes. You know, the
Yeah.
upbeat, dancey bass line where it's like, okay, you're going to have to get up out of your seats out of this one. We're not sitting down. We're not sitting down. We're dancing, which I love. I love the gear. My favorite two gears that Blur takes is the melancholy giant sound gear and then this gear, the dancey, fun, upbeat. We're going out clubbing, dancing. You know, you just feel it's almost like songs made for a movie. It's songs where like you put it on at the club and everybody's like, okay, we're getting up, we're dancing, this is fun.
It's also combines, like, if you take a dancey sort of sound like that and you put it in a minor key, I mean, I'm a sucker for that. Like, that's I'll take that any day of the week.
Yeah,
One of the
that's
things I love about that.
isn't that so European or British? Like, it reminds me of a Train Spotting soundtrack. It's like America loves these bouncy, bass-driven lines, but in America, we do it with major chords, and then
Yeah.
you throw those minor chords in there. It's like, oh, this is crazy. It's like, ooh, we're dancing, but we're sad and disoriented, and who knows where this is going to end up.
Yeah, it's so true. I love it. It's one of my favorites, and it takes us to the end of the album, which is Yuko and Hero. More than any other song on the album, aside from Dan Abnormal, feels kind of autobiographical for Damon, especially regarding his relationship with Justine Frischman. I didn't know that at the time. It's a fan favorite Blur song, unusual, a weird song. I appreciate it more now than I used to. It used to be the type of song where I just didn't really let that one play out. I could kinda hear some later Damon, like a precursor to even some Gorillaz stuff. I think some of that is in a song like "You Go and Hero." The strangeness of it, it's a little more sparse than the rest of the album. There's just something about it that's like, okay, this guy is gonna explore more of this territory later on, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I definitely feel that. I love the awkwardness and just pushing the envelope, just we're going to be a little different. I love that.
Yeah.
I love how the Great Escape, we're talking about those three live albums. And I love how the Great Escape, for me, we're talking about how great Park Life was and how the Great Escape was a follow up to that. We've already debuted it number one, and everybody's expecting big things from us. And to me, it's just an ascension. Starts with Modern Life is Rubbish, and then Park Life. And for me, Great Escape just builds on Park Life. I love Park Life, but I love Great Escape too. And I don't feel like it was just a sloppy tag along to Park Life. I feel like Great Escape stands on its own, just as important as Park Life. And to me, it kind of just capped off the journey that they took on these live albums. I loved the transition that Blur took after that. I love their self-titled album and 13. So to me, as I look back in the kind of evolution of Blur, Great Escape to me is just this natural evolution of, okay, here's the Life albums, and we're gonna top that off and bring it to a conclusion, then embark on a new journey. I love Great Escape because I feel like it's one of those albums that I think people love music that feels comfortable and feels familiar. I feel like your average music fan who actively listens to music would put on Great Escape for the first time and be like, wait a minute, have I heard this before? Because this sounds really good and really familiar.
Like, I just don't know what it is about Damon's writing, but it's so infectious, but it's also it seems to never end. Like it's even though he evolves and I think Blur evolves significantly, there's always that thread of just well-written songs and well-crafted music. It's just interesting to me too where this album is. I love knowing about the history of it and appreciating it in the chronology of Blur's body of work, but I think it's a fitting end. I feel like this album is very uh, uh, for lack of a better word, like maximalist. Like there's a lot that is crammed into each song. It's filled to the brim, but never excessive. For me, it's never too much of like, oh, they did too much there, but it's right at the max of like, we have horns and we have strings and we have melodies and we have a couple different guitar parts and we have all of this stuff going on. And it really, I think it's a perfect, like you said, I think it's a perfect end to that because it builds and builds and there's so much to this and it's just like at the brim. And then from here, because of the fallout of this and because of the massive success of What's the Story, Morning Glory, and the ensuing backlash that like Blur is always having to hear about this, and they're just, and I think that even before that whole rivalry, I think the pressures of everything was just becoming a lot, and Graham is really disillusioned with where they're at as a band. He writes Damon a letter because he doesn't really even have the confidence at that point to go up and tell him this in person. But he says he wants to make music that scares people again, like they did in their early days before they were even recording albums. And that's what they do with the self-titled album. I mean, there's some stuff on that that is very unusual. You don't see that happy kind of goofy Damon anymore. And I think that part of Damon kind of goes away after that. It's not that they don't continue to be occasionally a little silly or something like that, but it's nowhere near the extent it is early on. It's something much more nuanced, much more, at least often darker, but equally energetic. Just really great stuff that comes in the wake of this album. And so for me, it's like whether I'm thinking about it in the context of Blur's other work or I'm just listening to it independently, like we found it, which is just here's this thing, and you came from the Great Escape with this new thing like Moses from the mountaintop with I found another one. That feeling, that's why I wanted to talk about this album. I mean, I see the album cover and it just makes me happy. It's like
Put
there's
it
a
back up there. Put it back up there. You didn't let it put it back up there and let it.
look at that. Just a beautiful blue, people on a boat, someone jumping in. I
How
mean,
many times do you think over those 3 albums, the 3 live albums that we've discussed, how many times do you think Damon Albarn talks about going on holiday? It has to be at least 6 or 7 times per album.
the other thing he references a lot on these albums is America. If you're British, you're constantly inundated with what's going on in the US, whether it's politically or whether it's their movies or whether it's the music, and you're just constantly bombarded with American this and American that. And I feel like Damon pushes against that and is like, you know what? I want to talk about what's going on right here, what I see in front of me. It's interesting though that Graham is starting to pull a lot of influences from American bands like Pavement around this time, and he's really getting into that sort of like more alternative rock in the Pavement zone than more of the grunge stuff. And that you can hear that when he really has a big influence on the direction that they take with the self-titled album. And then into 13, I think is just an entirely other gear too. I mean, where they go after here and where Damon goes, and then the longevity of the band. Again, I think that yes, you have to talk about this album in the context of What's the Story, Morning Glory, and what a phenomenal success that album was. But I think that if you to zoom out now, I feel like what Blur has accomplished over the last 30 years is pretty amazing. Just prolific, even though their output isn't the same. I mean, what Damon's done in the meantime, the work that Graham's done in the meantime, but like Gorillaz is like his whole other entity to itself. I mean, it took off more in the US than Blur did, which makes sense. I mean, it's more hip hop, it's more electronic, it's more geared. I don't even know if it's intentional. I think Damon really wanted to do it, but he also, I think, has this sort of feather in his cap of, I did kind of conquer America. Maybe it wasn't with Blur, but we watched that Coachella set. Just saying, you might as well sing along to Park Life because it's the last time you're going to hear it. I think what he's saying is they're going to step away for a while, but that was written about like, oh, Blur criticizes the Coachella crowd. Not a great crowd that first night. Even the second night is like, it's not like seeing them play at Wembley or Hyde Park, but that's not what they were going for. They were doing something different. They were reacting to music that, even though it's music that I really like, I can appreciate someone in that mindset that's like, I have to hear this stuff all the time. I'm going to do something different.
Growing up in America, we've got so much stuff. We're not looking at what's going on in India right now. What's topping the charts in India? Or what's topping the charts in Bangladesh? Check that out. So, America has so much stuff. We don't even have time to look at other stuff. So that's interesting to think about somebody being like, you know what? I live in an awesome country called England. So I'm just going to focus on British stuff and screw that. As far as the gorillas thing, you know, I'm so glad that Damon Albarn decided to do gorillas because personally, I love the gorilla stuff. Not as much as Blur. I'm probably a bigger Blur fan than gorillas, but not gorillas isn't far behind. But I know this for a fact. Some Americans have zero concept of Blur. They haven't even heard of Blur.
Hmm.
But there are some people who've heard of Blur but couldn't even name you a song. You're like, I think I know Blur. I'm like, do you know any of their songs? They can't even name song two. And then when
Right.
you say song two, they're like, oh, I know song two. Oh, that's Blur.
Yeah.
Everybody knows Gorillas.
Yeah.
Every American knows Gorillas.
Yeah.
may not be able to name you a song.
I don't have a ton of bands that I, like, have gear from, but just one of my favorite all-time bands, and I have, like, a Blur shirt, and I was on at work one time, and I was speaking with somebody I don't talk to that regularly, but I had my Blur shirt on, and they were like, "Are you wearing a Blur shirt?" And I got so excited because no one comments on it. I've had people comment on, like it's an image of a car. I've had people be like, "Ah, what about that Lincoln?" And I'm like, I don't know. I don't know, man. It's Blur. But anyway, this one person was like, "Hey, Blur." And I was like, "Yeah, you know Blur?" They're like, "Yeah, man. Woohoo, the Woohoo song, song 2." It's like, "We used to listen to that before hockey practice." And I was like, that's the one thing.
That's
I mean,
all
I'm
I know.
glad they have it, I'm glad they got that song. It was a big I'm sure it made them a lot of money, and it really did bring them into awareness of us. I mean, that's how we found them, and for people who are willing to explore that band more, I think they found something really interesting if it was their cup of tea, and it was for us, but,
How
I mean, you're
crazy is that? We're talking about a band who've had multiple number one albums. Park Life, Great Escape. I don't know, did 13 or self-titled. I don't know if it debuted at number one. But I'm talking about Blur was the pinnacle of British pop music. And Americans don't even know. Blur was England, the country closest to America, maybe Canada. We're not talking about Harvey Danger or Not a Surf. This is Blur, and people don't even know who they are. One of my wife's best friends, her husband is a drummer, and, we have this is like a newer friendship. So it's like a new friend who is also a big music fan, and he's 10 years older than us. I would think right in the prime time of Blur, knowing who Blur is. No concept of Blur. Bad.
It is sad because 'cause they're missing out. If there's anything we can do to change that, then I'm happy about that because more people need awareness of them. If they like this type of music, there's a treasure trove of how many albums. And you're right, dude. They released The Ballad of Darren in July of 2023. So, basically a year ago, debuts at number one. It was their seventh album in a row to debut at number one. They're still that relevant and popular over there. You hear people younger bands over there. Britain has a lot of really good guitar bands that have come out. One like was listening to this a great band, Fontaines DC, and the lead singer was talking about how he saw them play at Wembley, and it was just a really profound experience for him. And so they're continuing to have influence. It's no surprise that these days, if you want this type of music, if you want a guitar band or if you want a band that does this, you kind of look to what they're doing. Here, it's different. It's the course of our music has changed a little bit. I mean, I'm not saying that's all bad. There's a lot of good stuff out there too. But yeah, it's like if someone is into this type of music at all, there's so much that awaits them in Blur's discography. And if there was one thing that I wish is that someday somebody uses them in a TV show that's wildly popular or something, and it's like there's a revival of interest in their music.
Somebody's
Yeah.
gonna have some show that's gonna have it's about a TV show drinking coffee, and coffee and TV is gonna be the hit. And people
Yeah.
are gonna listen to that, and then they're gonna be like, wow, did you know about this band called Blur that came out all these years ago? This classic rock band called Blur. Dude, does that disturb you or scare you at all with people are like, hey, let's flip it over to the classic rock channel? And it's like
Yes.
Foo Fighters, Pearl
Yeah.
Jam, like this is classic rock now? Oh,
It really takes the wind out of your sails. Yeah.
me. Park Life came out 30 years ago, my friend.
That's insane. And like you said, it holds up. It holds up. If a band released that today,
It
I
would
would
be a
like call
crowning
everyone I know.
It would be a
Yeah.
crowning achievement. People would be like, okay, here's a band who says, screw what everything's moving towards. I'm going to go back to what is really awesome.
Yeah.
That's what I love about all the music that we love is when I go back and listen to it, even those albums that you brought up that came out in 1995, like Everclear, Sparkle, and Fade. I can even go back and listen to that album and be like, rocks just as much today as it did 29 years ago.
What about Melancholy and the Infinite Sadness? Like, what an album, you know?
That album, first of all, we're not here to talk about the Smashing Pumpkins, and I was never a big Smashing Pumpkins fan. That may be the most underrated album of all time.
It's a great album.
I mean, feel like it got a little buzz when it came out, but that's like a crowning achievement in itself.
You know, it's funny too, when I'm thinking about music today, there are a lot of really good bands that I recommend to people from England. I think Fontaines DC is a great one, Shame, Idols, and they're all like influenced. You can hear some influences from some of the bands that we've talked about, but they're very different. They're more in the post-punk sort of heavier side of things. Sometimes they're evolving. All three of those bands are evolving, but even a band like Young Fathers or something, like I always recommend those bands. And I think that there's so much good music that's coming out from there right now too. But it's really, if I were to say to someone, oh, you really like Blur, what's a modern band that you'd be into? I'd say, well, check out those bands I mentioned, but there's not like, they're so singular, they're so unique that there's no parallel to draw other than like when Blur releases a new album, like or Gorillaz comes out with a new album. It's like you have to look to the source still because I think that speaks to the quality of work they continue to do. But then it's also just of how unique they are. And where like Blur didn't even sound like the Great Escape ever again after the Great Escape. That was it, you know, because they evolve and they continue to do that. I think the Ballad of Darren was like an evolution for them too. Maybe the last Blur album we'll get, I don't know, but I'm just grateful that we have so much work from them and things to go back to listen to, like The Great Escape. And for people that want to go back to this time period, to be in 1995 and see what this band was doing at the time, I recommend a White Room performance that you can find on YouTube. There's a Jules Holland performance that they did in 1995. Those are all really, I mean, they're clicking. They've got the swag going on. It's really impressive to watch them play these songs live, and songs that they don't really even play that much with a couple of exceptions. I'd like to recommend Graham and Alex's book. Graham Coxon and Alex James both have books, and they touch on these periods to a certain extent, and they have their own perspectives on them. Graham certainly went through a lot during this period. For guitar nerds out there, there's a dude who plays guitar covers. It's just this kid who like plays he's like figured all these Graham Coxon parts out, which is really not an easy thing to do because he does such unusual things. It's just I can just sit there and watch him play Blur songs forever. So God bless that man for doing the Lord's work and interpreting the Graham Coxon's work. There's also another guitar channel with a guy who teaches a lot of songs. His Steve Little Riffs is that YouTube channel's name. And I mean, again, it's a guy probably our age who just loves Graham Coxon and occasionally likes to go through the songs and figure them out and show people how to play them. So if you care about that stuff, check that out. The world of Blur out there is never ending. There's always something there to go back and discover or rediscover and listen to. So yeah, dude, it's been a pleasure to talk about the Great Escape with you. I'm looking forward to our next conversation, but this is just an album I'm going to keep coming back to every few years. You know, why not?
It's always in my playlist.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a classic.
And let's face it, we're not in 1995 anymore. We don't have to take out a compact disc and put it in and sit at track one. But if I can implore any person watching this, listen to He Thought of Cars. And if you like that, listen to another Blur song. And if you like that one, pick up an album and start it at track one and let the thing breathe, bro.
Yeah.
You're not.
Yeah.
It will not. If you spend an hour listening to a Blur album, it's not an hour that you will regret. I promise you that.
Couldn't have said it better myself. All right, buddy. Well, this has been great. We'll talk again soon.
Keep rocking in the real world, brother.